Well, I hope you all are ready for another session on the book of Daniel. And this time we're going to do the 8th chapter. Before we study this book, I just want to remind you a few things. While studying the book of Daniel, we need to bear in mind a few things. Number one, we're reading a book in 2021 AD that was written sometime after the Babylonian captivity, approximately 600 BC. Well, we could be wrong in the year, but let's say we're reading this book 2000, at least 2000 years later. Okay, all right, and then it was first translated into the Greek language in between 2nd and 1st BC. Okay, and then our translation or version came into being after the 16th century. The first English translation or the official English translation was in 1611, a King James Version. So we're, in essence, what I'm trying to say is that we're reading something translated into our language, in this case, English, but translated many centuries later. To understand the historical things in this book, which we already handled in the previous sessions, we need to go through the history. And also to understand the prophetic things, we need the help of history, especially in those cases where the prophecy or the prophecies have been completely or partially fulfilled. And then also, we need to remember that everything we are going to read in this 8th chapter, and also whatever we studied in the 7th chapter, and then everything we're going to study in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and the 12th chapter, was still future when the prophet received it. But for us, some of the things are already history. So we need to bear all these things in mind when we study the book of Daniel. Or I think this is applicable for any prophetic book. And we need to rely on Holy Spirit, which I don't need to say. So while we have the help of history and then other writings of different scholars, we should always rely on Holy Spirit to accurately understand this book. In this 8th chapter, Daniel tells us about another vision he had. And I'm sure you read that chapter, so you know what I'm going to say. And just want to add a few more things, that Daniel wrote chapters 8 through 12 in the Hebrew language. And we talked about that in our introduction to this book in the first session. All the other chapters, all the previous chapters were written in Aramaic, except for the first chapter, if I remember correctly. And then chapters 8 all the way to 12 are written in the Hebrew language. And these chapters 8 to 12, they specifically deal with the Gentile dominion and how that is going to affect Israel or the Jewish people. And this vision that Daniel is going to tell us happened in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. If you remember, he had a vision in the 1st year of King Belshazzar. In fact, it was a dream with the 2 visions in it, and we talked about it in our last session. So this, I would say, came to him 2 years after that. And Daniel must have been in Babylon for 70 years. That means he must have been 87 or so by that time. So he must have been an old man by that time. Let's look at the place of the vision. Daniel saw himself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. Now, depending on the version you're reading, it may say the citadel of Susa or the Shushan, the palace. Different versions translated differently. But what we know is that he was in his vision, he was in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam, and he saw himself beside the Ulai gate or the Ulai canal or river. And from history, we know that Susa was the capital of Persia, and it was in the province of Elam. And we do not know whether Daniel was literally in the citadel of Susa at the time of this vision, or whether he was in that place in the vision. We are not sure about that. But what we know about the citadel of Susa or the Shushan palace is that this place, Susa, was situated 200 miles east of Babylon at the time of Daniel writing about his vision. And it had no particular significance at that time. But later, now remember, Daniel is seeing this vision during the time of Babylon, but we are talking about Persia. Okay. I said Susa is the capital of Persia, but it was still this vision came to him during the time of the last Babylonian king. So at that time, this particular city had no significance. I hope it is clear to you. But later, this city became the capital of the Persian Empire. And you can read that in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, and also in Esther chapter 1, verse 2. So you can look those verses up later. In his vision, Daniel saw a ram with two long horns standing beside the river. And you guys understand a ram is a male sheep. It had two horns. One of them was longer than the other. And he also specifies that the longer one came up or grew up later than the shorter one. So the first one that grew was smaller, and the second, I don't know how he knew that in the vision. Maybe he just knew it in the spirit, that the second horn, which was longer, or the horn that was longer came up later. He just knew that. And in this vision, we have one animal, one ram with two horns, and that indicates that there was a unity between two kingdoms, because the horns always in the Bible indicate authority, and therefore, depending on what is being shown or depending on what is happening, it can refer to the king. And in this vision, these horns actually represent the kings. So there are two kings or two kingdoms or two races of people, but one animal. So it tells us there was unity, and it is referring to Media and Persia, which again we will refer to them when we come to the interpretation part. As of now, we know there were two horns and one animal, representing that there were two races or peoples, two ethnic groups. And then Daniel saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. And it says very clearly that no other animal could stand in front of it, and no one could escape from its power. There was no one who could rescue anything or anyone from this ram's power, but he did as he pleased and continued to grow. And then when we come to verse 5, we have another animal. This time, instead of a ram, we have a goat. And Daniel stood there and he watched the ram closely. And while he was thinking about what was happening, he saw a goat coming from the west. And pay attention to these places that we read: east, west, south, and north. These locations are important for interpretation when we cross-check the information with the history. So we have a goat coming from the west, and it says it crossed the whole earth without touching it. The goat had a prominent horn between its eyes. The goat then came up to the ram that had the two horns. The goat charged furiously at the ram and struck him. The two horns of the ram broke off. The ram was helpless, and the goat knocked him down and trampled him. No one could rescue the ram from the goat's power. And now some versions says a male goat, and some simply say a goat, and it looks like it was a male goat. This male goat became very powerful, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. Now, pay attention to everything, because when we come to the interpretation, it's going to be very interesting. The large horns in the place of that large horn of this goat grew four prominent horns pointing in the four directions of the earth. That's verse 8. After that, we have another important information. Then from one of those prominent horns, that is, from one of those four prominent horns that grew in four different directions, came a small horn whose power grew very great. Now, don't get confused this little horn with the little horn that we studied in the previous chapter. So this is a separate little horn, and that was a separate little horn. And if you ever feel confused, you can go back to the notes of chapter 7 and go through it, and it will become very clear. That particular horn, little horn, came out of the fourth kingdom. In fact, the revived fourth kingdom, or we can call them the fifth kingdom, or let's say the last kingdom. And that was the 11th king that came from the revived last or final kingdom, or final Gentile kingdom, when the Lord comes for judgment. But here we have a different little horn. So don't get confused just because it says a little horn. So now we are focusing on the little horn. It extended towards the south, the east, and the glorious land, or the beautiful land, depending on which translation or which version you're reading. This is verse 9. It continued to gain power until it reached the army of heaven. It threw some of the army of heaven, the stars, down on the ground and trampled them. It even challenged the commander of heaven's army by canceling the daily sacrifices offered to him by destroying his temple. The army of heaven did not respond to this rebellion because God restrained it. This happened because of the transgression, the rebellion, and ungodliness in God's people. The daily sacrifice was halted, the truth was overthrown, the horn succeeded in everything it did. Now, please remember, the horn represents a king, is a very powerful king. When the events in this vision ended, Daniel heard two holy persons talking to each other. And while they were talking, they were asking, one person was asking the other person a question. But Daniel very clearly says these two were holy people or holy persons. How long will the things in this vision, the daily burnt offering, the destructive rebellion, the surrender of the holy place, and the trampling of the army take place? That was a question. And then the other person answered and said, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed and properly restored. This is verse 14. When the vision ended, Daniel wanted to know the meaning of this vision. While he was thinking about it, he saw someone who looked like a man standing before him. And then he heard a human voice calling out from the Ulai River. Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of his vision. That is verse 16. So when this person, that is Gabriel, came up to Daniel. He was terrified and immediately knelt down. Now, this is the first place in the Bible where an angel is named. You will see Gabriel in the New Testament, but New Testament came later. So in the Old Testament, so in the entire Bible, we can say this is the first time an angel is named, or the angel is identified by his name. And looking at the way Daniel responded, we can say when we see some great heavenly beings, we do not know how to respond. Apostle John did a similar thing in Revelation chapter 22, verse 8. And you can read that later. Now, as soon as the vision ended, an angel showed up, and it was not just any angel, it was Gabriel. And he began to explain the vision to Daniel. So we don't need to interpret the vision because the angel is now interpreting it. He is giving the meaning. So we just have to receive the interpretation. And then what we're going to do is we will check with the interpretation with the history that we already have available. So he told Daniel that the vision was about the appointed time of the end. Now, when you read that sentence, please don't think it is about the end of the world or it is the day of the judgment. No, it is not. It is not talking about the day of judgment or the day of the Lord, but it is talking about the end of an appointed time. And he said the two-horned ram represented the kings of Media and Persia. That is verse 20. Now, Gabriel did not say much about this ram, meaning the kingdom of Medo-Persia. Immediately after making that statement, he went on to say that the male goat or the shaggy male goat represented the king of Greece. The large horn between his eyes represented the first king of the Greek Empire. And we know from history that the first king of the Greek Empire was Alexander the Great. Well, I don't know why they call him great, but that's how he's known. The four prominent horns that replaced the one large horn means that the Greek Empire will break into four kingdoms. But none of them, once they are broken or divided into four kingdoms, none of them will be as great as the original unified kingdom. Now, all this information is in the Bible. Okay, now, when we check with history, this is very accurate. Everything we read so far has taken place very accurately. I mean, everything in the sense, when I say everything, I don't mean the vision, I mean the interpretation, okay? So this chapter, this 8th chapter is in the prophetic section of the book. We just know that, and it's good to remember that. We are no longer in the historic section. We are in the prophetic section. And the prophetic section gives information about the future of Israel. And when Daniel was seeing this vision and receiving the interpretation, everything Gabriel told Daniel was still in the future. And an interesting observation here is that the vision and, of course, the interpretation also begins with the Medo-Persia and not Babylon. Even though Daniel was still in the kingdom of Babylon, the vision begins with Medo-Persia. And you may wonder why it is so. Well, the only reason I can think of is that this was the 3rd year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, and it was also marking the end of the Babylonian Empire. So the vision begins with Medo-Persia. Now, although this prophetic section of the book is primarily meant for Israel, or is talking about the future of Israel, there are many things we can learn from this. As a matter of fact, when we started off the book of Daniel several weeks ago, I said we should study this book with a purpose. We should always ask ourselves, what can we learn from this book? And then how we can, or what is it that we can learn so that we can apply it in our time? And every book in the Bible should be studied with that or with similar goals. We should always ask ourselves, what are we learning today? And then how can we apply it in our time? So there is a great learning in this chapter, and we may not be able to discuss that in today's session, and I don't think we will be able to complete this chapter today. So in the next session, we will talk about all those things we can learn or we learned, and you can also do your own study and see what you're learning while reading this book or while studying this book. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had a vision about the successive Gentile kingdoms. And when he saw that vision or dream, I don't remember, I think it was a dream, it started with Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. And because the information God gave to him was for him and his people, the Gentiles, at that time. But now the information that God is giving to Daniel is meant for Israel. So that's why that's another reason we see this vision starting with the kingdom of Medo-Persia. So you'll see the difference, even though Nebuchadnezzar had information about the second and the third and the fourth kingdoms, he didn't get all the details that God is now giving to Daniel. And while interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel did not name the successive kingdoms. He said, the first one is you, and then there will be a second, third, and fourth. But now we know we know from history that Medo-Persia was a second kingdom, but we also know from the scriptures in this particular chapter, the angel told Daniel that the ram represented the Medo-Persian kingdom. So what we know is that secular history most of the times confirms what is already in the scripture. And the angel went on to explain that the two horns represent Media and Persia, and then the horn that grew up later was longer, meaning it represents Persia, and the smaller horn represents Media. And in the alliance between Media and Persia, Persia was more powerful, more dominant. Again, this can be verified from history. Now, I said the angel did not say much about the Medo-Persian Empire. He immediately went to describe the goat or tell Daniel the meaning of that shaggy male goat. Well, we have information from history that we can check and see, because in that vision, Daniel saw the ram going towards west, north, and south. And what that means is the ram or the Medo-Persian kingdom expanded towards west, north, and south. And from history, we know that westward, the Medo-Persian kingdom had actually conquered Lydia, Western Asia Minor. That is, if you remember from the book of Revelation, Sardis. Sardis is actually the capital of Asia Minor, Western Asia Minor. Then Ionia, that is Western Asia Minor, near to Smyrna, another church in the book of Revelation. Then Thrace, that is the region of Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. We are talking about the modern places. And then also Macedonia. Northward, the Medo-Persian kingdom had conquered the Caucasus region, that is southeastern Europe, and the Scythians, and also the Oxus Valley, that is northern Afghanistan. Then southward, the Babylonian Empire, and later Egypt. And historians say that during the initial phase of their conquest, the Medo-Persian troops were nearly invincible. Now let's come to Greece. If you remember, Gabriel said that the shaggy male goat was the king of Greece. And why they have a goat, or why is a goat representing the Greek kingdom or the kingdom of Greece? Well, I have this information from history that the first Greek colony was established by an oracle that sent a goat for a guide to build a city. The goat came to the region of Greece, and in gratitude for the goats leading them in the right direction, they called the city the Goat City. The name of the sea upon whose shores the city was built was called the Aegean Sea, or the Goat Sea. And you will find figures of goats in Macedonian or Greek monuments. And someone once said that 200 years before the time of Daniel, the Greek were called the goat's people, or the people of the goat. We have this information about Greece and how goat became the symbol of Greece. The angel also said that this goat came from the west. Well, Daniel said originally, then when the angel interpreted it, he said this represents the kingdom of Greece and the first king. Historically, the Greeks came from the west, that is the area of Macedonia and Greece. And I already told you that this prominent horn between the eyes of that goat represented Alexander the Great. And when Daniel saw the vision, he saw this goat coming from the west, but he said it crossed the world or crossed the whole earth without touching ground. And it's because it was moving so fast that its hooves barely touched the ground. And historically, Alexander's expansion spanned, I think, 12 years. In 12 years' time, he conquered almost the entire known world. And remember, in the previous chapter, the kingdom of Greece was represented by a leopard with 4 wings. So wings are used for flying. It was so fast. The expansion took place within a short span of time. Yeah, the historian says that in 12 years' time, Alexander conquered the entire civilized world without losing a single battle. Of course, you can cross-check with other historical information to see what I just told you is correct or not. And then it says, well, Daniel said the goat attacked the ram, and during that attack, both the horns of the ram came off. It was shattered. And historically, we know that the Greeks launched an unprovoked attack upon the Persians in 334 BC. Don't get hung up on the year because I'm not sure. I'm getting information. I'm taking information from different historical sources, and each one has a different year. So, but approximately during that time. And then in that vision, Daniel saw that the goat knocked down the ram and trampled him. This actually depicts the Persian Wars, which occurred between 334 to 331 BC. And also, historians say that Alexander's conquest of the entire Near and Middle East within 3 years stands unique in military history and is approximately portrayed by the lightning speed of this one horned goat. Of course, we should remember from history that the Persian imperial forces had numerical superiority. They had military equipment like war elephants. Even then, they could not stop Alexander. They were defeated by Alexander. And again, historian says that Alexander, with his disciplined Macedonian phalanx, were able to rout the Persian army. And then it says the goat became very great. Maybe that's why he is known as Alexander the Great. And what that refers to is Alexander was able to influence even the kingdoms outside his borders. We know that he reached as far as Afghanistan and India. Even though he did not conquer any part of India, but he was able to reach. And that statement that this goat grew or became so great or very great refers to these things. And this may also refer to the spread of the Greek culture worldwide. And when I say worldwide, I mean the entire known world at that time, or the civilized world at that time. Then we have an interesting information in verse 8 that Daniel said that at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. And we know again from history that at the height of his fame, Alexander became very arrogant. He began to believe that he was a god. And when he liberated Egypt from Persian control or tyranny, the Egyptian priesthood had proclaimed him to be the descendant from Zeus, that is the Greek goddess, or Jupiter, the same god or goddess as for the Romans. And therefore he expected his comrades in arms to prostrate before him. Then Alexander the Great died at the age of 33 of a sudden fever. So, and that's what it means when Daniel says, at the height of his power or fame, his horn was broken off. He died. And then we have information that from that great kingdom of Greece came out 4 other kingdoms. In fact, it said the 4 other horns came up in its place towards the 4 winds of heaven. That means in 4 different directions: south, west, north, east. And Gabriel, while giving the meaning of the dream, did not give the names of these 4 kingdoms, but he named Medo-Persia and also the kingdom of Greece. But from secular history, we know how the kingdom of Greece was divided, and the 4 generals of Alexander, divided the kingdom into four, and then each general began to rule as the king over that particular section of the Greek Empire. Okay, as for historians, Cassander ruled Macedonia and Greece, and well, I don't know how they pronounce this name, but I have it from the Greek. It says Lysimachus ruled Thrace and most of Asia Minor. Then Seleucus ruled lands to the east, including Babylonia, and he later secured Syria and Israel. Then Ptolemy ruled Egypt and parts of southern Syria. All this information you can get from history. Now, Medo-Persia is gone. Greece is also gone. Greece is divided into four different kingdoms, and then four different kings or rulers are ruling the different section or the divided kingdom of Greece. Out of these four kingdoms, Daniel saw another horn rising up. And he says very clearly, very specifically, that this was a small or little horn. And of course, you know that horn represents authority. And in this particular vision, it stands very clearly for a king. And the angel, Gabriel, did not name the king that would come, or the small horn, or the king represented by the small horn coming out of from one of these four kingdoms. And the fact that it was a small horn or a little horn represent the fact that this king had a small or humble beginning. Because Daniel says that it was a small horn or a little horn. But also, then we have information from verse 9 of this chapter that he grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. So let's check the history now. South refers to Egypt under the Ptolemies. East refers to the Seleucid kingdom, that is Syria and Babylonia. And beautiful land refers to the kingdom of Israel. And you can check Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 6 and 15. And it refers to Israel as the most beautiful land or glory of all lands. Daniel saw first the Medo-Persian kingdom, and then he saw the kingdom of Greece, and then he saw the divided kingdom of Greece with four different kings ruling the divided sections. And then he saw one king with a small beginning or a humble beginning coming out from one of those kingdoms. This small horn, grew until he reached the host of heavens. That is verse 10. And then he threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. He set himself up to be as great as the prince of the host. He took away the daily sacrifice meant for the prince of the host. He ruined the sanctuary, that is, he desecrated it or profaned it. Then we have additional information that God restrained his army or the army of heaven from responding to this rebellion. Now, this king, who had a very humble beginning, he became so great and so powerful that he stopped the sacrifice, he threw the truth to the ground, he prospered in everything he did. Now, Gabriel explained to Daniel that at the end of their rule, meaning the rule of those four kings, a fierce king, a master of intrigue, would rise to power, and that is in verse 12. Okay, and I think I will stop here, and when we come back, we will pick up from here because this is very interesting. So you can wait for another week, and you can do your own study also, and we will pick up from history some information about this one particular king who came out from one of those four kingdoms, and then history will tell us from which kingdom he came. And he became so powerful and so great that he began to attack. Now, the Bible gives you some interesting information. I'll read it to you again. It says, he grew until he reached the host of heaven. And then he threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. And then he set himself up to be as great as the prince of the host. So what is the Bible talking about? When we come back next time, we will study that and reconcile that with the historical information. And then we will move on to the rest of the interpretation. Actually, in this vision, the most prominent or the most important information is about this one king, the last king, or, well, I wouldn't say the last king, but the last king of this kingdom, and what he did, and then we have historical information so that we can check with history, and then we have the name of that person. But I think it's better to discuss that next in our next session. And when we complete the next session, we will know what all we're going to learn. As of now, we know one thing for sure, that God is the actual author of history. Even though man writes history, God already knows history even before anything would happen upon the earth. If you go through the historical evidences of the Medo-Persian kingdom and also the kingdom of Greece, you will come to know that whatever God told Daniel was very accurate. And for this reason, and also because of the things we're going to study further, many critics, not followers of the Lord, but the critics of the Bible believe that the book of Daniel was written after this particular king. That means after the time of this king, because everything God said about this particular king also came to pass very accurately. So that tells us one thing, that God is in control of history, and his word is very powerful. It has authority, and whatever God said is going to come to pass in the future also. So we can really trust God's word. So with that, I would like to close this first session, and when we come back, we'll study more.